I am joined by Caitlin Huey-Burns and Hunter Walker. Caitlin is our CBSN political reporter, and Hunter is a White House correspondent for Yahoo News. Great to see both of you. Caitlin, let's start with some 2020 campaign news. First of all, Vermont Senator and former presidential candidate Bernie Sanders endorsed former Vice President Joe Biden. What does this mean for the Biden campaign?
Hi, Elaine. Well, in the age of coronavirus, the new Unity rally is now taking place online. Bernie Sanders joined Joe Biden on his live stream today to announce his endorsement. The timing was a bit surprising, but the endorsement itself wasn't necessarily. Remember, earlier on in this race, Bernie Sanders has said from the beginning that he would unite around whoever became the Democratic nominee. Today, he said that he was endorsing Joe Biden, throwing his weight behind him, and encouraging his supporters to do so. Biden himself welcomed those supporters with open arms, saying that he understands the urgency and that there is a place for them in the campaign. What was significant that came out of today's endorsement, though, besides the endorsement itself, is that Bernie Sanders said that his staff and Joe Biden's staff have been working behind the scenes, creating different task forces on various issues, from education to the economy to healthcare to immigration, criminal justice reform. So this shows that the two teams have been kind of working together on policy issues with a focus of trying to bring the party together before the November election.
Well, Caitlin, is it likely that Sanders supporters will back Biden following this endorsement?
Well, that's what we're going to be watching. Just because Bernie Sanders endorses Joe Biden doesn't necessarily mean that all of his supporters will join that effort as well. But this was a move by the Bernie Sanders team and by the senator to start that process right now. Remember, when he got out of this race last week, Bernie Sanders said that he would remain on the ballot in the remaining primaries in an effort to garner delegates to be able to influence the Democratic Party platform before the conventions or during the conventions this summer. You have various members of his coalition who have yet to endorse Joe Biden, but that could be coming later on. It really depends on how they take this news coming today. But today was very clear that Bernie Sanders was setting this process in moving forward. And today, by announcing these various task forces with the Biden team, was a step to say that, look, the Bernie Sanders team can have an influence on this campaign. So it remains to be seen whether these supporters will move forward, but Biden himself has been welcoming them. And it was really interesting to hear a kind of a shift in Biden's message today. He said that it's not enough after this pandemic to just go back to normal, go back to the way things were, that it was important to join together and focus on rebuilding after this. And that's kind of an embrace of some of the things that Bernie Sanders has been talking about, moving beyond just the status quo.
Interesting. Well, Hunter, let's talk about the Trump administration. The president appears to be at odds with the nation's top infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci. What's behind that, and what is the White House saying about that?
Well, this kind of came to a head over the weekend when the president retweeted a message on Twitter that had the quote-unquote "Fire Fauci" hashtag. And that message was specifically pointing to comments Fauci made in February, where he, sort of diminished the threat of coronavirus somewhat and implied the nation could reopen. But the real larger context of this was an interview Fauci gave on television where he said, the Trump administration could have done more to respond to the coronavirus pandemic earlier. And this is coming on the heels of extensive reporting showing that there were warnings from within the government that this was really, really going to be dangerous as early as January. Specifically over the weekend, we saw a lengthy New York Times report detailing all of the times President Trump was warned about this and sort of chose to minimize his response. Most damningly, I think, was one element in the report that said that the president actually needed to be pushed when he did ultimately announce a partial travel ban with China. And that's the thing that President Trump keeps pointing to argue that his response has been, as he once said to me, a 10 out of 10. So, Fauci conceded that there were some mistakes made. And essentially, the president, sent out this tweet referring to times Fauci, frankly, towed the Trump administration party line more and minimized the situation. When the White House was confronted about the president tweeting this clear hashtag Fire Fauci message, they sort of preposterously said that, it was ridiculous to suggest he might actually want to be firing Fauci, even though that is specifically what he put out on his own Twitter.
Right, and we know that it is the president himself, not members of his communications staff, that controls the media messages coming out on that Twitter account. Hunter, let's look forward here. We have learned that the president is putting together what will likely be called his Council to Reopen America. His daughter and senior advisor, Ivanka Trump, will be part of it. What more do we know about what the group will be focusing on?
Well, the composition of the group is getting a lot of attention right now. As you noted, Ivanka Trump is on there. So is her husband, Jared Kushner, who's also a senior White House advisor. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin is on there, as is the Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross. And, one thing that I'm seeing is a lot of critics are questioning why there are not people with more substantive public health and scientific expertise on this committee. And I think, by its composition of mostly, administration loyalists, economic officials, and also by its name, a committee to reopen America, this is yet another sign that, the president is toying with the idea of loosening some of the social distancing and quarantine restrictions that we've seen. One thing that's come out in a lot of the reporting is, this is a president who has staked his reelection effort on what was, prior to the coronavirus pandemic, really strong economic performance. And he's been very preoccupied at every turn with how he's responded to this crisis with the stock market performance and with the state of the economy, which has just tanked as, people have been required to stay home and not engage in normal economic activity. But one thing I would say is, I think a lot of people see this as sort of a black and white. President Trump sort of trying to save the economy and cover himself, but, versus the cost of human life. But, I've talked to some economists and seen some discussion out there that there really is a discussion going on of what is the cost of life to not shutting everything down versus what is the cost of life and quality of life long term to these more draconian measures. And, there are some economists who say at some point, even if it does mean that the death rate may be higher, we do need to move towards this discussion of reopening the country at least somewhat.
Yeah, really impossibly difficult questions and choices lie ahead. Caitlin, the administration's social distancing guidelines do expire at the end of the month, but some governors have orders extending beyond that date, and the president says he has the authority to, quote unquote, reopen the country. What's the reality there, and what kind of fight is this potentially setting up with the nation's governors?
That's right. The president has said that the decision to open up the government again or open up the economy again would be the hardest that he has to make. But actually, it's really not up to him. Remember, there's no national order. There's no national shutdown. The shutdowns that we've seen have been implemented by the governors themselves. And you're seeing that in effect. More than 40 states have had some kind of shelter in place or some kind of shutdown in their states. And that has been kind of driving all of this. So it will be up to the governors really to open things back up again. And that could set up a clash of sorts between the governors and the president, depending on how things go. Now, the federal government and the president can issue guidance. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing from the White House, that's kind of pushed. But really, it is up to these governors in the states. Just today, Governor Cuomo joined forces in New York with several other northeastern states like Pennsylvania and Connecticut and New Jersey, and they decided that they are going to consult each other and make these decisions together in terms of opening things back up again. Governor Cuomo said today that the worst is over, and so you do see this effort by some governors to start taking those steps and planning how they would reopen things. But again, this is a decision really left up to the states. And the president himself, when asked over the past several days why he wasn't pushing some states to issue shutdown orders in their states. He said that this is about federalism, that it's up to the governors, and he trusts their decision. So we'll see if that holds as we get into further plans to reopen parts of the country.
Hunter, throughout this pandemic, the U.S. Postal Service, as we all know, has continued to operate, but you have some reporting about the future of the Postal Service. What have you learned?
Right. Well, the Postal Service is a pretty unique part of the government. It is a quasi-governmental agency in the fact that it has not gotten taxpayer funding since the 1980s. It operates on profits generated by mail service. But since 2006, the agency's been in some trouble because it was required to pre-fund retirement obligations for a lot of postal workers. Those economic woes have been drastically exacerbated by the coronavirus. And the Postmaster General has said she's not sure they have the operating cash to continue beyond October. So, this has been a well-known situation, and ahead of the recent coronavirus stimulus legislation that we saw pass Congress, there was a lot of talk and there was a big push to get cash for the Postal Service included there. Ultimately, that didn't happen. They were just given approval to get a $10 billion loan from the Treasury Department. Sources I've been talking to, including union leaders and some on the Hill, have said that there was actually bipartisan support to get the Postal Service money, but it was President Trump and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin who blocked it. And the union leaders were attributing this to a desire on the part of the White House and Secretary Mnuchin to ultimately privatize some of the Postal Service. What I subsequently found out was that this $10 billion that was authorized by the stimulus, and most postal advocates say that's not nearly enough to help head off these financial woes, that loan wasn't even approved by Secretary Mnuchin. So I reached out to the White House, I reached out to the Treasury Department. They really did not answer the question of whether the president or the Treasury Secretary ultimately want to see the Postal Service privatized. And they also could not really explain why the loan had been delayed, even though they said the Treasury Secretary was, quote unquote, supportive. And one thing that's really interesting about this question of privatization here is that the Postal Service has what's called the Universal Service Obligation, and they are required to serve every address, including less profitable and more remote rural addresses, for the same rate. And advocates worry that a private company would have no such obligation to serve the less profitable portions of the country. One thing that was really interesting in all of the reporting for this is, as much as the White House and the Treasury Department are not addressing this question of whether they want to privatize the Postal Service, there was a task force ordered by the president and led by Secretary Mnuchin that expressed openness to this. So there clearly is interest in privatization on the part of the administration. The question is whether they're using this, exacerbation of the Postal Service's woes in the coronavirus crisis to move forward with that goal.
We know you'll continue to watch it. Finally, Hunter, this pandemic has affected all of us, of course, in very different ways. We are all working from home, but you recently wrote about your mother-in-law who is working on the front lines of the coronavirus pandemic. What can you tell us about her?
Well, my mother-in-law, Gina, is part of the EVS, Environmental Services Department at White Plains Hospital in Westchester County. And this is, one of the counties right next to New York that's been among the hardest hit by the coronavirus crisis. And she went on Facebook the weekend before last and posted a message where she said that this is her chance to thank New York for helping her family's dreams come true. And, Gina has this amazing story. She and my wife and my sister-in-law and my father-in-law, they all came from Peru in 2001. And so for Gina, I ended up discussing this with her because the tweet just blew up where I shared her message. And she said that, America has helped her family live its dreams. Both her daughters were able to go to college. They own a home now. And, even though she's afraid of getting infected as she works in this hospital, she does feel like this is her chance to give back to New York after it's given our family so much. So she's done a lot of different interviews. The tweet was shared over 170,000 times by people. And it's nice to see Gina and other hospital cleaners getting recognition, but also hopefully her bringing a little bit of a smile to people at this really tough time.
Yeah, it's so remarkable to see the depth of gratitude that she has for this country. And one can only hope that she understands that gratitude is very much returned by everyone who has read her story. All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns and Hunter Walker, so wonderful to see you both. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Elaine. Stay safe.